Hi everyone, and welcome to Epic Chess, the channel that helps you improve your chess fast. Today we're going to be looking at a game played between Levon Aronian with the white pieces and Vladimir Kramnik with the black pieces, and I want to focus on the positional concept of seizing the initiative. So Aronian kicked things off with the white pieces by playing pawn to e4, Vlad went pawn to e5, we had knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, the start of the Roy Lopez, and now Vlad plays the Berlin defence with knight f6, and in response to this, Aronian goes for the closed variation with pawn to d3. Now we have bishop to c5, and here Aronian decides to give up his bishop pair by taking the knight on c6, but in doing so, he does remove a defender of this d4 square, and he'll later look to push in the centre with moves like pawn to c3 and a later pawn to d4. He also doubles the pawns here for black, so black now recaptures with the d-pawn, opening up the light squared bishop. Aronian now castles in this position. It should be noted that if he jumps in to take this pawn on e5, then black has the very common tactic in reply. Perhaps pause the video to see if you can find it. Here black can play queen to d4, a double attack on the knight on e5 and the pawn on f2. So this is why the pawn on e5 is poisoned, and instead Aronian just castles here. Now the pawn truly is under attack, so Vlad protects it by playing queen to e7. And here Aronian plays h3. Now you can see the logic of h3. He doesn't want to have this bishop jump out and pin the knight. But what's really interesting is how Vlad actually uses this as a lever to carve open the position later. And he actually plays in a really dynamic and aggressive way now. So there are some common moves for black to play here, such as castles, maybe a queenside expansion with pawn to a5, even h6 to prevent this bishop coming to g5, but instead Vlad here plays the move rook to g8. So a really nice idea, just saying to white, I'm going to attack you on the king side and go all out here. And this is the thing about looking to seize the initiative. It can put your opponent into a very uncomfortable position, take them out of standard positions which they might be looking for, and also start to burn down their time on the clock. So where you can seize the initiative, it is a very powerful thing. So we'll look at ways in which Vlad starts to seize the initiative in this game in the moment, so that you can then use similar techniques in your own game. So Aronian now plays king to h1. He's anticipating this attack down the g file, and he wants to sidestep his king out of the way. It also moves it away from the x-ray of this bishop, which is coming down on the dark squared diagonal. Vlad now plays knight to h5, looking at this sensitive f4 square, possibly opening up the f-pawn for later in the game. Aronian plays pawn to c3, and this is an important concept to remember. If your opponent is trying to blow you away on one side of the board, down one of the flanks, then trying to counter in the centre of the board is often a good counter strategy in response to that threat. Vlad carries on with pawn to g5, not yet bothering to castle his king, and now Aronian jumps in and takes this pawn on e5. Because if the queen now recaptures this knight, then the white queen on d1 can now chop this knight on the edge of the board, and actually white is doing okay here. It's hard for black to break through straight away, because if the pawn pushes, the queen on e5 drops, and soon white might even be able to consider moves like pawn to f3 to solidify this structure, and then he has a very overwhelming advantage in the centre, with pawn to d4 coming, and a lot of pawns rolling through the centre of the board at the black king, which hasn't yet castled. So Vlad didn't go in for this, and this is an important concept about seizing the initiative. He doesn't want to waste time recapturing that knight with his queen, letting the white queen come out, halting his attack. Instead, he just ploughs on here with his attack, seizes the initiative by playing pawn to g4. And this is a great move, because if white were to recapture, there's a very simple threat here which black can now execute. If you want to pause it and have a look, then do so. Black here can play queen to h4 check, and after the king sidesteps to g1, there's now the devastating knight move, knight to g3, taking advantage of the fact that this pawn is pinned to the king by the bishop on c5, and the threat here is to play queen h1 checkmate, and there's actually nothing that white can do in this position to prevent that. So coming back here, after g4, white doesn't take that pawn. Instead, Aronian goes d4, countering in the centre. Vlad responds to this by dropping the bishop back to d6. we now have pawn to g3, trying to close things down on the g-file. And here Vlad simply chops that powerful knight on e5, which is really looking over to all of the black position. And after pawn recaptures, he moves in with the queen, winning a pawn, but also bringing his queen into the danger area of the board. Aronian now looks to trade queens by playing pawn to d4, and again this is an instructive moment. So if you have a raging attack against your opponent's king, generally speaking you want to look to keep the queens on the board, unless it's a trade down into just a clearly winning endgame. So Vlad drops the queen back to e7. Aronian now plays h4, looking to close the lines against his king, so that move is logical. Vlad now kicks away white's queen with pawn to c5. Aronian drops into c4. We have bishop e6 developing, chasing that queen around, and after check on b5, Vlad now has a nice response to this by playing pawn to c6, not only defending against the check, but then protecting this b7 pawn laterally with the queen on e7. So it stops Aronian from jumping in and chopping that and picking up counterplay. Aronian is forced to retreat the queen, and unfortunately he's losing quite a lot of time here. This queen has jumped around the board to d4, c4, b5, a4. So that's 4 queen moves in the last 4 moves for Aronian. In the meantime, his bishop, his knight and his rook are all stuck at home here in their starting positions, and that's always a recipe for disaster. So after queen a4, Vlad still continues not to castle. He sees that he can actually just crack open the position here with pawn to f5, and so that's what he does, further seizing the initiative. Aronian looks to develop his pieces now, so he brings this queen's bishop out to g5, hitting the queen. And again, you might want to pause here and think about what you might play. And bear in mind, the theme of this game is about seizing the initiative. So how can black continue with a raging attack in this position and not let white have the chance to consolidate and bring his pieces out into the game? So here Vlad simply chops that bishop off on g5. And after pawn recaptures, he pushes on with f4. Now he could also take the pawn with the queen here, and he still has a great position with a strong attack. But again, in the interest of keeping a very strong initiative, Vlad sees that he can pick up that pawn at any point, and why not continue on with f4 to keep trying to crack open the white king. So Aronian's now really struggling in this position to find a good plan. He brings his queen back, looking to bring it back into the defence of the position. But again, Vlad now picks up a tempo with rook to d8. We have queen c1, looking at this f4 square further. And now simply pawn takes by Vladimir Kramnik. And if the pawn recaptures on f2, we now have this knight on h5 jumping in, giving a check and actually picking up the rook on f1. So Aronian now plays knight to a3, looking to develop his pieces into the game, but unfortunately at this stage it's all too little too late. Vlad jumps in with this rook on d3. He doesn't even bother recapturing this pawn because we know that if white captures, the pawn is poisoned. We have rook to d1, trying to challenge this d-file and remove an active piece. And now the start of a really nice combination from Vlad. If you want to pause here and have a think what you might play, I'll actually flip the board here if you want to consider this from black's position. So it's Vladimir Kramnik to play. He has a devastating combination which he can unleash here, and definitely have a look at all of your attacking pieces which are in the game here, all ready to jump against the white king, including this dangerous queen on e7 which could come in within a couple of moves. So in this position, Kramnik played bishop to d5, a really nice move showing the weakness on this white squared diagonal. He's leaving his rook on prise here. He's also leaving his bishop on prise to the pawn if white wants to capture like that. And this game actually reminds me of a lovely game played by Vishwanathan Anand against Vladimir Kramnik in their 2008 World Championship match, where Anand did something very similar using this d4 square in the checks against the black king on g1. So here Aronian actually played f3, looking to try and close down this dangerous diagonal. But if we look at what would have happened if he'd, say, taken the bishop here, then simply black can respond by jumping in with the queen, giving a check along this diagonal, and it's actually mate in 5. And if white takes the black rook on d3, then again we have the exact same checkmating pattern. This time the queen takes again, and now we have the battery of bishop and queen lining down against the white king, and again this is simply lost. The line which gives the most resistance is pawn to f3, but now this can be taken by the pawn on g4, and these threats of moving the pawns down the board coupled with this battery against the white king, it's simply too much to cope with. So coming back here, that's why Aronian played in this position, pawn to f3, trying to close down the diagonal. Vlad now took that pawn, and we can see he's got these devastating pawns on the 6th rank now, storming down towards the white king. Aronian took the material on d5, trying to bring his rook across to the e-file now, and skewer the black queen to the black king. But here now Vlad plays a really nice finishing sequence. He jumps in with the queen on e2, seeing that after rook to e1 to pin the queen to the king, he can actually just play pawn to g2, check, and in this position Aronian actually resigned because the whole game is lost. If the king were to sidestep to g1, then Kramnik can just keep these pawns rolling, and after the king moves away, we can promote this pawn on g1 and the whole position is collapsing for white with mate in 2 moves. So a really nice game by Vladimir Kramnik, and one that demonstrates the power of seizing the initiative. For me, there's a couple of really powerful lessons here about seizing the initiative. One is that you shouldn't be afraid to give up material if it keeps a strong initiative going and you're likely to keep an advantage in the long run. And we saw that with the exchange sacrifice on g5, where Vlad simply gave up his rook for that powerful dark squared bishop that was preventing the attack from being continued. And the second key lesson here is that if you are trying to build an attack against your opponent, then look to make moves which drive that attack home. You don't want to waste time or tempos in recapturing material on a part of the board which isn't important to the attack, especially if it can be recaptured at a later point, or you can produce an even greater threat by delaying the capture of that material. So I hope you enjoyed this game. Don't forget to like, comment, share, subscribe to never miss a video in the future, and I hope to see you again on another video.